In November of 2002, I started looking into some magazine stories for women's magazines, and someone told me about some parents in Los Angeles that were treating their children with autism with alternative treatments, and I thought that sounded pretty interesting. One of the mothers in California told me that some people suspected that mercury in vaccines was causing this epidemic. And just about 5 days later, the Homeland Security bill was passed by the House of Representatives. And that's when they inserted the rider secretly to dismiss all the lawsuits against Eli Lilly and the vaccine makers for having put thimerosal into vaccines. And that was the very first time I'd ever heard of thimerosal. And before I could even really start researching it, Bush administration lawyers went into the federal vaccine court and filed a motion to seal all the government records, all the documents, all the data permanently. My journalistic alarm bells went off, and I thought people who don't have anything to hide don't usually act in this manner. And I started researching the ties between Eli Lilly and the Bush administration, and there were many. If autism is purely genetic, then why do we see such a rapid increase in the case rates, and particularly in California, which has only tracked full-blown autism for the last 35 years. They've never expanded the criteria, and yet we've seen year after year after year the case rates go up. You cannot have a genetic epidemic. So therefore, how could this be purely genetic if the case numbers are going up? Now, they might argue that they're not going up. It's always been 1 in 166 kids or people. We just weren't very good at noticing them. It's pretty hard to not notice an autistic person, but that would be my number one point, that there, don't you think there has to be an environmental trigger at play here? I certainly do. And if there is, then what is it? And if you look at the rate of increase in this country, according to Pediatrics, the journal, no fan of this theory, they published a study that said the peak years of increase were between 1987 and 1992. Kids born in those years, that's when we saw the greatest increase in cases. Well, that's when all the mercury, the extra mercury, was put into the new shots on the schedule. HIB in 1988 and hepatitis B in 1992. I would also ask them why published studies have shown that autistic children are unable to excrete mercury at the same rate that typical children can. They retain it, they don't excrete it. I would ask them why autistic children have very low levels or depleted levels of these sulfur-based proteins that typical people have. It's a natural defense that we've evolved over the thousands of years to protect ourselves from heavy metals. Autistic kids don't have that protection. So wouldn't it stand to reason that that child exposed to mercury would have a much harder time processing and metabolizing it than a typical child? I would ask them about recent primate studies that show that ethyl mercury, when it crosses into the brain, converts to inorganic mercury. Ethyl mercury and methyl mercury are both organic forms of the metal. They both cross into the brain. Methyl mercury will cross into the brain more readily, but ethyl mercury converts to inorganic mercury, which has no natural transport mechanism to get out of the brain. So in these primate studies, we now know that the inorganic mercury gets trapped in there. I would ask them why these primates who had the inorganic mercury in their brains had a rapid brain growth, a hyper neuroinflammation of the white brain matter, the exact same thing we see in autistic children. I would ask them why autistic children have this altered immune profile that's completely different than typical children, that's also consistent with mercury toxicity or mercury exposure. Elevated natural killer cells, elevated B cells, an inversion of the Th1, Th2 cytokine, antibody versus cellular response to immunity, or for immunity, I should say. I could go on, but I think those are the biology, the toxicology, the cellular level, the animal models. Look at Mady Horning's study when she exposed thimerosal to sensitive mice, mice with an autoimmune propensity, and normal mice in the same species. The autoimmune mice reacted terribly to the mercury in their vaccines, whereas the typical mice had no effect whatsoever. The autoimmune mice also had larger brain sizes. So there is a host of biological evidence that is building and would tend to refute the epidemiological evidence presented by the government.